They mocked the Virgin Man for letting the Apache girl sleep in his barn. But the tribal chief's words left all in tears. The sound of horses' hooves thundering past Ezra's cabin at dawn meant only one thing in Copper Ridge. Trouble was coming. But as he peered through his weathered window shutters, watching the dust clouds settle over the main street, Ezra Whitmore had no idea that this particular morning would change everything. Everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and what it truly meant to be a man. The 29-year-old blacksmith had built his reputation on two things: the finest horseshoes this side of the Colorado Territory, and a stubborn refusal to take a wife. Every matchmaker in town had tried to pair him with their daughters. Every one of them had failed. What they didn't know, what he'd never told a living soul, was that Ezra had never so much as kissed a woman. In a town where men bragged about their conquests over whiskey and cards, this secret burned like a brand against his chest. The commotion outside grew louder. Ezra could hear Sheriff Morrison's booming voice cutting through the morning air, followed by the nervous chatter of townsfolk gathering in the street. He pulled on his leather apron, the familiar weight doing little to settle the unease in his gut, and stepped outside. He squinted against the harsh October sun that painted the Colorado mountains in shades of amber and gold. "What's all the fuss about, Sheriff?" called out Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, her flour-dusted hands planted firmly on her hips. Sheriff Morrison spat into the dirt. His weathered face was grim. "Apache raiding party hit the Brennan homestead last night," he said, and the street went quiet. "Burned it to the ground. Family's gone." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. All except the girl. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The Brennan farm lay 15 miles east, close enough to make every person in Copper Ridge's blood run cold. Apache raids had been increasing throughout the territory, and everyone knew the stories. Stories that kept children awake at night and made grown men check their rifles twice before bed. "Where's the girl now?" asked Dr. Holloway, pushing his wire-rimmed spectacles up his nose. "That's the peculiar thing," Morrison replied, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Found her walking along the creek bed about 3 miles from town." He looked around at the gathered faces, his gaze lingering on each one. "But here's what don't sit right. She ain't hurt, not a scratch on her, and she was walking toward town, not away from it." Ezra felt something twist in his stomach. Apache raids were brutal affairs. No one walked away unharmed, especially not a young woman. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Could be they let her go as a warning," suggested Tom Bradley, the saloon keeper. "Happens sometimes. Send a message to the rest of us." "Or maybe she ain't as innocent as she looks," added Martha Sinclair, the preacher's wife, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Could be she was working with them. How else you explain her coming out without a mark?" The crowd murmured agreement, and Ezra watched as fear transformed into something uglier. He'd seen it before, how quickly grief and terror could curdle into hatred and blame. It was easier to point fingers than to face the reality that any of them could be next. Sheriff Morrison held up his hand for silence. "Now, hold on, all of you. The girl's in Doc Holloway's office right now, and she ain't said more than 2 words since we found her. She's in shock, plain and simple. Name's Ayanna Brennan, 20 years old, and she's got nowhere to go." "Brennan?" Mrs. Henderson frowned. "I thought old Jakob Brennan only had boys." "Adopted daughter," Morrison clarified. "Jakob took her in when she was just a child. Her real parents died of fever down in Arizona. She's been with the family near 10 years now." The crowd exchanged glances. An adopted daughter. With mysterious origins. Surviving an Apache raid unscathed. The combination fed their suspicions like kindling to a flame. Ezra could practically see the story growing and twisting in their minds, becoming more sinister with each whispered conversation. "Well, she can't stay here," declared Mrs. Sinclair. "Not if there's even a chance she brought this trouble upon us. We got children to think about." "Where's she supposed to go, Martha?" Dr. Holloway challenged. "The girl's got nothing left. Family's dead, home's burned. You want to turn her out into the wilderness?" "Better than having her bring more Apache down on our heads," Tom Bradley muttered, and several voices rose in agreement. Ezra watched the young woman through Dr. Holloway's window. She sat perfectly still on the examination table, her long black hair falling like a curtain around her face. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders curved inward, the way she held herself as if trying to disappear entirely. She wore a simple blue dress, somehow still clean despite her ordeal, and her feet were bare and dusty from walking. Something about her stillness, her quiet dignity in the face of tragedy, stirred something deep in Ezra's chest. He'd always been drawn to wounded things, injured horses, stray dogs, broken tools that others had given up on. But this was different. This was a young woman who'd lost everything, facing a town full of people ready to believe the worst about her. "I'll take her in," Ezra heard himself say. The street fell silent. Every single eye turned to stare at him, and he felt a hot flush creep up his neck. He'd spoken without thinking, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "You'll what now?" Sheriff Morrison asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Ezra cleared his throat, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "I said, I'll take her in. Got a spare room in my cabin, and Lord knows I could use help around the place. She can stay until she figures out what she wants to do." The silence stretched longer, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the cottonwoods that lined Main Street. Then Mrs. Sinclair let out a sharp, piercing laugh. "Ezra Whitmore, have you lost your mind? You're going to let some strange girl with Apache ties live in your house? What kind of Christian man does such a thing?" "The kind who remembers what the good book says about helping strangers," Ezra replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "And she ain't Apache. She's Jacob Brennan's daughter, and she needs help." "She needs help, all right," Tom Bradley sneered, a cruel smirk on his face. "But not the kind you're thinking about, Whitmore. We all know you ain't exactly experienced with women. This one's likely to eat you alive if she don't signal her Apache friends to come finish the job first." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was the kind of nervous laughter that came when people were scared and looking for someone to mock. Ezra felt his face burn with embarrassment, but he stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "That's enough," Dr. Holloway interjected sharply. "The man's offering Christian charity, which is more than the rest of you can claim. Miss Brennan needs rest and care, not a lynch mob." "She needs watching is what she needs," Martha Sinclair insisted, pointing a bony finger at Ezra. "Mark my words, no good will come of this arrangement. That girl's trouble, and Ezra Whitmore is too green to see it." More laughter, louder this time. Someone from the back called out, "Maybe she'll teach old Ezra a thing or two," which brought howls of amusement from the men. Ezra clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar sting of being the town's favorite target for jokes about his bachelor status. He met their mocking eyes, one by one, his own gaze hard as forged steel. Sheriff Morrison studied Ezra's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're serious about this, Whitmore, I appreciate it. Saves me having to figure out what to do with her. But I'll be checking on you both regularly, just to make sure everything's on the up and up." "Wouldn't expect anything less, Sheriff," Ezra said. Morrison's voice carried a warning. "First sign of trouble, Whitmore. Any trouble at all. You bring her straight to me. Understood?" Ezra nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what kind of trouble the sheriff expected. As the crowd began to disperse, still muttering among themselves, he realized he'd just committed to something he had no idea how to handle. He'd never lived with another person, let alone a young woman who'd just survived a traumatic attack. The thought made his palms sweat. Dr. Holloway appeared at his side, his medical bag in hand. "You sure about this, Ezra? It's a noble gesture, but that girl's been through hell. She's going to need careful handling." "I know what I'm doing," Ezra lied. The doctor gave him a skeptical look. "She hasn't spoken a word since Morrison brought her in. Just sits there, staring at nothing. Could be she's seen things that would break a grown man's spirit. You ready for that kind of responsibility?" Before Ezra could answer, the door to the doctor's office opened, and Ayanna Brennan stepped out into the sunlight. Up close, she was even more striking than he'd realized. Her skin was the color of warm honey, and her eyes, dark as midnight, held a depth that seemed to see straight through him. She moved with a quiet grace that reminded him of a deer in the forest, alert and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She looked around at the faces still lingering on the street, taking in their suspicious stares and whispered conversations. When her gaze met Ezra's, he saw something flicker in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd expected nothing better from the world and wasn't surprised to find her expectations met. "Miss Brennan," Dr. Holloway said gently, "this is Ezra Whitmore. He's offered to let you stay with him until you get back on your feet." She studied Ezra's face for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath. Finally, she nodded once, a small, formal gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and resignation. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and the sound sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. Her accent carried traces of something he couldn't quite identify. Not quite Mexican, not quite Indian, but something uniquely her own. "You don't need to thank me," Ezra replied. "Just doing what's right." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether she believed him. Then she looked back at the faces still watching them from doorways and windows, and her expression closed off again. The walk to his cabin took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like the longest journey of Ezra's life. He was acutely aware of Ayanna walking beside him, the soft sound of her bare feet on the dirt path. Every few steps, he caught himself stealing glances at her profile, trying to read the emotions that flickered across her face like shadows. His cabin sat in a grove of aspens about a quarter-mile from the main street, close enough to hear the sounds of town, but far enough away to feel private. "This is home," he said, suddenly seeing the place through her eyes and finding it wanting. The porch needed sweeping, and he'd left his dirty breakfast dishes on the kitchen table. Bachelor habits that had never bothered him before suddenly seemed slovenly and embarrassing. Ayanna stepped inside and looked around with those dark, unreadable eyes. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A ladder led up to the loft, and a door on the far side opened into what had been his storage room. "That'll be your room," he said, gesturing toward the door. "I cleared it out this morning and put in a bed. It's not much, but the window faces east, so you'll get the morning light." She walked over and peered into the small room. It contained only a narrow bed with clean sheets, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a wooden crate turned on its side to serve as a makeshift dresser. Ezra had spent 2 hours that morning making sure everything was spotless, but now he worried it looked too bare, too much like a prison cell. "It's perfect," she said, and he thought he heard genuine gratitude in her voice. "You must be tired," he said awkwardly. "Why don't you rest while I fix some supper? Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it'll fill your belly." She nodded and disappeared into the room, closing the door softly behind her. Ezra stood in the sudden silence of his cabin, wondering what in the world he'd gotten himself into. He busied himself with preparing the meal, trying not to think about the fact that there was a beautiful young woman sleeping just 20 feet away. The sun was setting by the time he knocked on her door. "Miss Brennan? Supper's ready, if you're hungry." The door opened immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside. She'd managed to wash her face and hands, and she'd braided her long hair back from her face. The simple change made her look younger, more vulnerable. "Please, just call me Ayanna," she said as she took a seat at his small table. "Ayanna," he repeated, liking the way the name felt in his mouth. They ate in a companionable silence, and Ezra was relieved to see that she cleaned her plate. Maybe it was just the comfort of being somewhere safe, somewhere she didn't have to worry about suspicious glares and whispered accusations. "The cornbread's good," she said, breaking the quiet. "My ma's recipe," Ezra replied. "About the only thing she taught me to cook before she passed." After she helped him clean the dishes, another surprise, since he'd expected her to retreat to her room, Ayanna stood uncertainly in the middle of his cabin. "I should probably turn in," she said. "It's been a long day. Of course, if you need anything during the night, just holler. I'm a light sleeper." She paused at her door and looked back at him. Ezra, thank you for taking me in when no one else would. I know what they're all thinking about me, and I know this can't be easy for you either. Before he could respond, she'd slipped into her room and closed the door. Ezra stood alone in his cabin, listening to the sounds of her moving around. He thought having another person in his space would feel intrusive, but instead, it felt right. Somehow. Like his cabin had been incomplete before, and he'd never realized it. He banked the fire and climbed up to his loft, but sleep eluded him. Every small sound from below made him strain to listen, wondering if she was having the nightmares Dr. Holloway had warned him about. The cabin remained peaceful, and eventually, he drifted off. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and climbed quietly down from the loft. As he started the coffee, he heard movement from Ayana's room. The door opened and she emerged, fully dressed, her hair once again neatly braided. "Morning," she said. "I hope I didn't wake you." "Always up early," he replied. "Coffee?" She nodded gratefully and accepted the cup he offered. They stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. In the soft morning light, she looked ethereal, almost too beautiful to be real. "It's peaceful here," she said. "Jakob's farm was always so noisy. Chickens and pigs and his boys arguing over everything. This is nice." "Gets lonely sometimes," Ezra admitted. "But I suppose loneliness is better than drama." She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his casual words to the loneliness beneath. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but not always." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Ezra looked out to see Sheriff Morrison riding up the path with two other men, Tom Bradley from the saloon and Marcus Webb, who owned the general store. None of them looked particularly friendly. "Stay inside," Ezra told Ayana, but she shook her head. "If this is about me, I should face it." They stepped out onto the porch together as the three men dismounted. Morrison touched the brim of his hat, but his companions made no such gesture. "Morning, Whitmore," the sheriff said. "How'd the first night go?" "Fine," Ezra replied. "No problems at all." "That's good to hear. Mind if we have a word with Miss Brennan?" Ayana stepped forward before Ezra could object. "I'm here, Sheriff. What do you need to know?" Morrison studied her face carefully. "Well, miss, we've been thinking about what happened at your farm, trying to piece together exactly how events unfolded. You feel up to answering some questions?" She nodded, though Ezra could see the tension in her shoulders. "Good. Now, when did you first realize the Apache were attacking?" "I woke up to screaming," Ayana said, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered across her face. "Jakob was yelling for everyone to get to the root cellar, but the house was already on fire." "And where were you when this was happening?" "In the barn. I'd been helping with a difficult birth. One of the mares was foaling. I stayed out there to keep watch." Tom Bradley snorted. "Convenient. You just happened to be in the one place they didn't bother to check." Ayana's chin lifted slightly. "They burned the barn, too. I barely got out in time." "So, how'd you manage to escape without them seeing you?" Marcus Webb asked, his tone openly skeptical. "I hid in the creek bed until they left. Then I started walking toward town. It took most of the night." "Creek bed runs right past Apache territory," Bradley pointed out. "Awful dangerous place for a young woman to be wandering alone in the dark." "More dangerous than staying where my family was being murdered?" Ayana shot back, and Ezra felt a surge of pride at the steel in her voice. Sheriff Morrison held up a hand. "Easy, all of you. Miss Brennan, I have to ask. Did you recognize any of the attackers? See any faces clearly?" Something changed in Ayana's expression. It was so subtle that Ezra almost missed it. A brief flicker of, what? Fear? Recognition? But when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "It was dark, and everything happened so fast. I was more concerned with staying alive than getting a good look at anyone." "But you must have seen something," Webb pressed. "Apache raids don't usually leave witnesses." Maybe that's because there usually aren't any witnesses to leave, Ayanna replied quietly. The comment hung in the air like smoke. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle while his companions exchanged meaningful glances. Well, the sheriff said finally, I reckon that's all the questions we got for now. Miss Brennan, you'll be staying here with Whitmore. For now, she confirmed. Good. Whitmore, you keep an eye on things, and let me know if anything unusual happens. Anything at all. The three men rode off, but not before Bradley turned back to call out, You be careful, Whitmore. Sometimes the prettiest flowers grow from the deadliest soil. Ezra felt Ayanna stiffen beside him, but she didn't respond to the insult. They watched the men disappear down the path, then went back inside without speaking. I'm sorry about that, Ezra said as he poured fresh coffee. Some folks in this town got more suspicion than sense. They're not wrong to be suspicious, Ayanna said quietly. What happened at the farm? It doesn't make sense. She paused, turning to face him. Not in the way they think, but it doesn't make sense. Something in her tone made Ezra look at her sharply. What do you mean? She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if she was choosing each one with immense care. The Apache who attacked us. They weren't strangers. Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. What? Her dark eyes locked on his. One of them was my cousin, my real cousin, from before Jakob took me in. His name is Nish. I hadn't seen him in 10 years. But I recognized him. The implications hit Ezra like a physical blow. If Ayanna had family among the Apache raiders, it changed everything. No wonder the attack seemed personal. No wonder she'd survived when the others hadn't. All of the town's ugly suspicions suddenly seemed horribly plausible. Did he spare you because you're family? Ezra asked, his voice rough. I don't know, she whispered, and there were tears in her voice now. I don't know why I'm alive, and they're not. I don't know why he looked at me the way he did, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I don't know anything, except that my adopted family is dead. And I'm alone again. She broke then. The composure she'd maintained since arriving in town crumbled like a dam bursting. Sobs racked her slender frame, and without thinking, Ezra stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. She felt small and fragile against his chest, and he could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. He'd never held a crying woman before, never known the particular ache that came from wanting to comfort someone whose pain was too deep for words. All he could do was hold her and let her grieve. When the storm passed, she pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize, Ezra said firmly. You got every right to cry. You've been through hell. She looked up at him with those dark eyes, now bright with tears, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or a recognition of two lonely souls who'd found something unexpected in each other. They'll come for me, won't they? She whispered. The town. The sheriff. When they find out I told you about Nish. Ezra tightened his arms around her. Let them try, he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go, I promise you that. It was a promise that would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The next 3 days passed in a strange sort of peace. Ayanna helped him around the forge, proving surprisingly knowledgeable about horses and metalwork. She had gentle hands with the animals and an intuitive understanding of their needs that impressed even Ezra, who'd been working with horses his entire life. But the town's suspicion grew with each passing day. Customers who'd been coming to his forge for years suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. Mrs. Henderson stopped waving when she saw him on the street. Even Dr. Holloway seemed uncomfortable when they passed each other near the general store. The isolation might have bothered Ezra more if he hadn't been so captivated by his unexpected houseguest. Ayanna moved through his cabin like a quiet shadow, bringing order to chaos without seeming to try. His shirts appeared clean and pressed, his meals became more elaborate, and somehow his rough bachelor quarters began to feel like a real home. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories of their childhoods and their dreams for the future. He learned that she could read and write in 3 languages, that she'd been taught traditional Apache healing methods by her birth mother before the fever took her, and that she'd always felt caught between 2 worlds, never quite fitting into either. On Thursday morning, everything changed. Ezra was at his forge, working on a set of shoes for the pastor's horse, when he heard riders approaching. Fast. Through the open door, he saw a dust cloud that meant serious business. Too many horses, moving too quickly for casual travel. "Ayanna!" he called, but she was already moving. Having heard the same thing he had, she appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "How many?" she asked. "Hard to tell. A dozen, maybe more." He reached for the rifle he kept near the forge, checking to make sure it was loaded. "Could be nothing." "Could be everything," she finished for him. The riders crested the hill, and Ezra's blood turned cold. Apache warriors, painted for war. But that wasn't the strangest part. Riding alongside them, under a white flag of truce, were Sheriff Morrison and his deputies. At the head of the group rode a man Ezra had never seen before. Older, with silver threading through his black hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "That's him," Ayanna whispered, her voice trembling. "That's Chief Kuchis." Her grip on Ezra's arm tightened. "And the one beside him. That's Nish." The riders stopped 50 yards from the forge. Close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. Chief Kuchis dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible and empty. "Ezra Whitmore," the chief said in heavily accented but clear English. "I would speak with you. And with the woman called Ayanna." Sheriff Morrison looked nervous enough to bolt, but he held his position. "Chief says he's got words for both of you. Says it's about what happened at the Brennan place." Ezra felt Ayanna's hand slip into his, her fingers cold and trembling. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. "We're listening," Ezra called back. Chief Kuchis studied them both for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "What I tell you now will change how your people see this woman," he said, his gaze fixed on Ayanna. "And how she sees herself. Are you prepared for such truth?" Ayanna squeezed Ezra's hand tighter. "We're ready." The chief nodded slowly, and when he began to speak, his voice carried across the morning air like distant thunder, setting in motion events that would transform not just 2 hearts, but an entire community's understanding of courage, sacrifice, and love. Chief Kuchis stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Ayanna's face. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and Ezra could see the deep lines carved by years of leading his people through impossible times. This was a man who had fought the U.S. Army to a standstill, who commanded respect from warriors and government officials alike. "Ayanna," the chief said, his voice softening slightly. "Eternal Blossom. Your mother chose that name because she knew you would bloom in places where others could not survive." Ayanna's breath caught. "You knew my mother." "I knew her before the fever claimed her. She was my sister's daughter, which makes you my blood. But more than that, she was a bridge between worlds, as you have become." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Chief, maybe we should get to the point. The townsfolk are already spooked enough without—" Kuchis silenced him with a single sharp look. "The point, Sheriff, is that your people are preparing to drive out a woman who saved this town from a war they could not win." "What do you mean?" Ezra asked, though something in his gut already suspected the answer would change everything he thought he knew. The chief gestured toward Nish, who dismounted and walked forward. Up close, Ezra could see the family resemblance. The same high cheekbones, the same intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "3 moons ago," Kuchis began, "warriors from a different tribe raided settlements near the Mexican border. They killed many people and took horses, weapons, food. The Mexican government blamed my people, as they always do. They sent word that unless the raiders were found and punished, they would attack our winter camps." Ayanna's hand tightened on Ezra's. "Papa Jacob." "He never mentioned any Mexican trouble." "Because Jacob Brennan was one of the few white men who understood that not all Apache are the same people," Nish said, his English accented but clear. "He traded fairly with us for many years. He treated you as his true daughter, not as a burden or a curiosity. The Mexican ultimatum created a problem, Cuchis continued. We knew the raiders were not our people, but proving this would require finding the real culprits. Meanwhile, pressure grew from both sides. Mexicans threatening war. Young warriors in my own camp wanting to strike first. A crowd was gathering from town, drawn by the sight of Apache warriors speaking openly with white men. Ezra could see familiar faces creeping closer. Mrs. Henderson with her flour-dusted apron, Tom Bradley with his ever-present scowl, Martha Sinclair clutching her Bible like a shield. 2 weeks ago, the chief said, his voice carrying easily to the growing audience, we discovered the truth. The raids were conducted by a rogue band led by a war chief called Kurik, who had been cast out from his own tribe for killing women and children. They were hiding in the mountains, between our territory and Jacob's farm. Sheriff Morrison's face went pale. You're saying these rogues were planning to hit more settlements? Not planning, Nish said grimly. Kurik had already chosen his next target, your town. He planned to attack during the harvest festival, when your guard would be down and your women and children gathered together in one place. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. The harvest festival was just 2 weeks away, the biggest celebration of the year. How many would have died? Dr. Holloway asked, his face grave. All of them, Cuchis replied simply. Kurik's hatred burned too hot for mercy. He would have killed every person in this town to send a message to the Mexican government. Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach. But he didn't attack the town. He attacked the Brennan farm instead. Because, Ayanna said quietly, understanding flooding her voice, someone warned you where to find him. All eyes turned to her. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady. Jakob knew, didn't he? He knew Kurik was using the caves near our property as a hideout. Nish nodded. Your father was a wise man. He saw the signs, tracks, missing cattle, smoke where none should be. He sent word to us through the old trading channels, asking for a meeting. The night of the attack, Cuchis said, we came to the farm not as raiders, but as hunters, seeking a common enemy. Jakob had agreed to help us find Kurik's camp in exchange for our promise to protect this town. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. But something went wrong, Ezra said. Kurik discovered the plan, Nish confirmed. He attacked the farm just as we arrived for the meeting. We fought them, but... His voice broke slightly. We were too late to save Jakob and his sons. They died defending their home, and their daughter. Tears were streaming down Ayanna's face now. They died because of me. Because I was Apache. Kurik thought the family was already allied with your people. No, Cuchis said firmly. They died because they chose to stand against evil. Because Jakob Brennan understood that protecting innocence was more important than the color of their skin or the blood in their veins. And you? Sheriff Morrison asked Ayanna. How did you escape? She didn't escape, Nish said, his voice filled with pride. She fought. When Kurik cornered her in the barn, she grabbed a pitchfork and wounded 2 of his warriors before I could reach her. She was magnificent. Fierce as a mountain cat. Brave as any warrior I have known. But the barn burned, Mrs. Henderson said, confusion clear in her voice. After we killed Kurik and his men, Cuchis explained, we burned it. To hide the evidence of the battle, to make it look like a simple raid. If the truth had come out, the Mexican government would have blamed us for harboring the rogue band. More innocent people would have died in the war that followed. The implications sank in slowly. Ayanna hadn't survived through luck or betrayal. She'd survived because she'd fought like a demon to protect her family, and because her Apache cousins had arrived just in time to save her life. So you see, Cuchis said, his voice carrying to every person in the crowd. This woman you call dangerous. This woman you whisper about and shun. She is the reason your children will wake up safely in their beds. Her family died to prevent a massacre, and she carries their sacrifice with honor. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and confusion. But why didn't you tell us this before? Why let us think? Because, Ayanna said, finding her voice again, You weren't ready to hear it. You saw Apache blood and assumed treachery. You couldn't imagine that my family died to save yours. And because, Nish added, revealing the truth would have required admitting that white settlers and Apache worked together against a common enemy. Both our peoples have those who would call such cooperation weakness. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her usual stern expression replaced by something softer. Child, can you ever forgive us? We've been so cruel, so quick to judge. There's nothing to forgive, Ayanna replied. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I understand that. But Martha Sinclair wasn't finished. This is all very touching, she said, her voice sharp with skepticism. But how do we know any of this is true? How do we know this isn't just some elaborate story to cover up? She was cut off by the sound of horses approaching from the direction of town. Dr. Holloway's son came riding hard, his face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. Sheriff, the boy called out. You need to come quick. Mrs. Patterson found something in her root cellar. Weapons and supplies hidden under the floorboards. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson lived in a cabin about 5 miles from the Brennan farm, close to the mountains where Keurig would have made his base. Mexican Army gear, she says, the boy shouted, and maps of the town, marked with attack plans for the festival. He took a deep breath, his eyes wide. And Sheriff, there's bodies in the cave behind her place. Looks like they've been dead about a week. Cooches nodded grimly. Kurik's remaining men. We hunted them down after the farm battle. They will raid no more. The evidence was overwhelming. Everything the Apache had said was true. My God, Dr. Holloway whispered. We could all have been killed. Would have been killed, Cooches corrected. Without Jacob's warning and his daughter's courage, your harvest festival would have become a funeral. The crowd fell silent, absorbing the full weight of what they'd learned. These people who had shunned Ayanna, who had whispered about her being dangerous, owed their lives to her family's sacrifice. Tom Bradley was the first to move. He walked slowly toward Ayanna, his hat in his hands, and when he reached her, he dropped to one knee. Miss Brennan, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you an apology that words can't cover. Your family saved my children's lives, and I repaid that debt with suspicion and cruelty. I'll carry that shame for the rest of my days. One by one, the other townsfolk stepped forward. Mrs. Henderson, with tears streaming down her cheeks, apologizing for turning away when Ayanna needed kindness. Marcus Webb, admitting he'd been wrong to question her story. Even Martha Sinclair, her Bible clutched to her chest, asking for forgiveness with a humility that shocked everyone who knew her. But it was young Billy Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, who broke everyone's heart. The 8-year-old boy pushed through the crowd and walked right up to Ayanna, his freckled face serious beyond his years. Miss, he said, his voice small but clear, my ma says your pa died saving us. She says if it weren't for him, the bad men would have gotten me and my little sister. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crudely carved wooden horse, the kind a child treasured above all else. This was my favorite toy, but I want you to have it, to remember that somebody appreciates what your family did. Ayanna knelt down to accept the gift, and when she did, the boy threw his arms around her neck and whispered, Thank you for being brave. That's when the tears came. Not just from Ayanna, but from nearly everyone watching. Grown men who'd fought in wars, women who'd buried children, tough frontier people who'd seen every hardship imaginable. All of them weeping at the simple honesty of a child's gratitude. Chief Coochis watched the scene with satisfaction. This is why your mother chose your name, he told Ayanna quietly. She knew that one day you would bloom in the hardest soil, bringing beauty from tragedy. The threat was ended. Peace would hold. The chief turned to Ayanna. And you? What will you do now that the truth is known? Ayanna looked around at the faces surrounding her, no longer suspicious or hostile, but filled with respect and gratitude. Then she looked at Ezra, who had stood beside her through everything, never wavering in his faith in her goodness. I'd like to stay, she said simply. If Ezra will have me, and if the town will accept me. This feels like home now. Child, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice firm. You'll always have a place here. We owe you and your family a debt that can never be repaid. More than that, Dr. Holloway added, the town needs a teacher for our school, someone who can speak multiple languages and bridge different worlds. Would you consider taking the position? Ayana's eyes lit up with a hope Ezra had never seen before, a dream she'd thought impossible. I'd be honored, she said. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement, Chief Kuchis approached Ezra privately. You are a good man, the chief said. When others saw only suspicion, you saw someone who needed help. That takes more courage than fighting in battle. I just did what felt right, Ezra replied, his face growing warm. Which is exactly what makes you worthy of her, the chief said, glancing at Ayana, who was now surrounded by children eager to hear more of her story. A blind man could see how you look at her, and how she looks at you. Do not let fear of inexperience keep you from claiming the happiness you both deserve. With that, the chief mounted his horse. As he rode away, he called back one final message that carried clearly across the morning air. Remember this day, people of Copper Ridge. Remember that courage comes in many forms, and that the greatest strength is often found in the gentlest hearts. As the dust settled, Ezra and Ayana found themselves alone on his porch. The events of the morning had changed everything. So, Ezra said, suddenly feeling awkward again. A school teacher. That's quite an honor. It is, she agreed. Though I'll need somewhere to live that's closer to the schoolhouse. Ezra's heart sank. Of course. She wouldn't need his charity anymore. I could help you find something suitable, he said, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. Ayana turned to look at him, her dark eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. Actually, I was hoping you might have a different suggestion. Ezra's heart began to pound. Such as making our arrangement permanent, not as charity or temporary shelter, but as something else. Ayana, he breathed. Are you saying? I'm saying, she interrupted, stepping closer, that these past few days have been the happiest of my life, because you've shown me what it means to have someone believe in you completely, even when you don't believe in yourself. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with a man who took in a stranger because it was the right thing to do. A man whose gentle heart is stronger than any warrior's blade. Ayana, Ezra whispered, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. The question is, she continued, reaching up to touch his face, her touch sending fire through his veins. Are you brave enough to love me back? For an answer, Ezra pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he'd been holding back his entire life. It was his first kiss, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if his lips had been waiting their entire life for this moment, for this woman. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ayana smiled the first truly joyful smile he'd ever seen from her. I'll take that as a yes, she said. That's a yes to everything, Ezra confirmed. To marriage, to building a life together, to facing whatever comes next, as partners. 6 months later, they were married in a ceremony that brought together people from both their worlds. Chief Kuchis himself performed the Apache blessing, while Pastor Williams conducted the Christian service. The entire town turned out to celebrate, weeping openly as the couple exchanged vows. That night, as Ezra held his wife in their marriage bed, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The lonely blacksmith, the town's favorite joke, had become a husband, a protector, a bridge builder between worlds. He'd learned that true courage wasn't about facing down gunfighters. It was about opening your heart when it would be safer to keep it closed. It was about seeing the person beneath the surface when everyone else saw only what they feared. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that courage was rewarded with a love that transformed not just two hearts, but an entire community. As sleep claimed him, Ezra smiled at the memory of the townspeople talking. They had once mocked the virgin man for letting the Apache girl sleep in his barn. But his courage to love created a legacy that would echo through generations. The story of Ezra and Ayana became a legend in Copper Ridge, a reminder that the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with open hearts. And in the end, that was the most powerful lesson of all. If you were moved by this story of courage and love against all odds, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart.